Hi, this tutorial continues on from part 1 where we saw how to make simple fades and transitions. In this part 2, we'll look at some of the different transition templates and how they work. Why? Because many of them have adjustable settings that change the way the transition behaves, and the settings are not the same for all types of transition templates. Topics to be covered include Transitions menu, Media Pool templates, Settings Fade through Black, Transitions Basic, Movements Basic, Shapes and Objects Basic, 3D templates, Timeline complications, third-party transitions, and bonus tips. In part 3, we'll look at the object and edit trimmers. In my previous tutorials on basic editing, we saw how to get objects onto the timeline, move them around, and edit them by cutting and trimming. And we saw how to use most of the tools on the main toolbar. If you don't know how to do this, you should review these other tutorials before continuing. I'm going to assume that you know what a trimmed clip means. For this tutorial, I'm using Movie Edit Pro 2021 Plus. Everything should also work the same in Video Pro X. I'll refer to Movie Edit Pro as MEP. And let's get started. We'll start where we left off. With a simple crossfade, click on the Transition button to open the menu. Starting at the top, we see Cut No Fade. Below that, with a red dot on it, is Crossfade. Below that is Fade Through Black. And then below that are Favorites, then a selection of the recently used transitions applied in this project or in other projects, so you can apply an oft-used transition without having to hunt for it in the list. Below that is List View, and I'll toggle that off to see icons, and back to the list. Then there is Show All Transitions, which gives a list of the categories of transitions. If you're not in List View, then you won't see the category names. Select a category to see the transition templates. Next is Random Transitions. This shows the categories and the number of transitions for each. Everything is checked. This is useful if you want to randomly apply transitions to all objects on the track in one shot by selecting Apply Random Transition in the track. You can uncheck those that you would not want to be included and then click on Apply Random Transitions in the track. I'll undo that. A side note here. Although Random Transitions shows up when applying a transition on a track other than track 1, actually, it applies a transition to track 1, not to the selected track, so be careful here. Then there is Apply to all objects in the track, including objects coming before the selected object. Apply to all of the following objects in the track, Set Transition Length, and lastly, Save as Fade Template. There will also be settings if the transition has settings that can be modified, which we'll soon see. Go to the Media Pool Templates tab, Transitions, and you'll see the same categories that we saw in the menu. Here you can preview them. Look through the categories. If you have only a few templates, then it's probably because you didn't download and install the extra content. See my tutorials on getting started in MEP. I also have some transition templates that I purchased through the store. You may not have these. As a reminder, the standard transition duration for a crossfade is 1 second. However, as we'll see, many transition templates use different transition lengths. At the bottom right of the media pool, when a transition template category has been selected, as soon as a transition has been made, a timer will show up. Since we have a crossfade, the timer is visible. Clicking on it should show the duration interface where you can change the duration of the transition, but for some reason it doesn't work on crossfades. Must be a bug. This is the same as the transition length that shows up in the transition menu. The format is minutes, seconds, and frames. Remember that the NTSC system uses 29.97 frames per second, so that putting 30 in the box and pressing Tab will give you 1 second. In PAL, with 25 frames per second, putting 30 in the box and pressing Tab will give 1 second and 5 frames. If you drag the slider slowly or use the right arrow key on your keyboard, you'll see that the frames box rolls over to 0 after 29 frames in my case, or 24 frames in PAL. If I drag the clip to the right, remove the overlap, then the timer button disappears. If I drag it back, the timer button shows up again. I'll open the transition menu by clicking on the transition button, and I'll select Fade Through Black. Click on the transition button again, and there's a new selection at the bottom called Settings. Look at the bottom right of the media pool, and there's a new gear shape button there for settings. I'll open the settings in the menu. An interface called Color Transitions opens. There's a color wheel, sliders, and the selected color is in the rectangle at the right. Note that all of the sliders are at 0, which is the setting for black. By using the sliders and dragging the point around the color circle, we can change the color of the transition from black to whatever we want. There's also a fourth slider to adjust the brightness of the transition. At the top are more buttons. The first one plays back the transition, showing the new color effect. Clicking on the second button turns it on. Now when you change the color, the transition will automatically play back. The third button resets everything but to white. I'll make a solid red transition and exit by clicking on the upper right X. Dragging the playback marker across the transition, we see that the first clip fades to red and then the second clip fades in from red. Click on the Settings button in the media pool and we see the same interface. Not all transitions have settings, so if a transition does have settings, you can tell right away because the Settings button will appear. We'll start with Transitions Basic. We have a Fade Through Black transition on the timeline. Looking at the transition buttons, we see that Color Fade has a red dot on it, meaning that this transition has been applied on the timeline. I'll remove the Fade Through Black transition on the timeline, and the red dot disappears. Select the Color Fade transition and play the preview. This looks like the Fade Through Black transition, except that it fades through white. To apply a transition template, drag it onto the head of the clip. A transition is created, and it plays back, fading through white. Click on the Settings button, and we see the same color transition interface that we saw before, but now the sliders are all at the right, at 255. Thus we have white. We already saw how to make adjustments here. I'll close that. Note that there's another template called Fade Through Black. Applying it keeps the red dot on the color fade transition for some reason. Let's try the first template, Alpha Magic. The preview shows what looks like a clock-minute hand transition. Great to illustrate that the second clip is something that came later on. I'll apply this and it plays back. Open the settings and we have a completely different interface called Alpha Magic. At the top are the same playback buttons that we saw before, but below are 21 icons representing different types of transitions. The first one, the timer sweep, is selected. Note that the icons are all black and white except the selected one. These are actually masks that are used by MEP to create different transitions. I'll click on the second one and press on the playback button to see the effect. I'll turn on the automatic preview button and select the third button. It automatically plays back. So you can go through all of these to see what they do and select the one that you want before exiting. Note that this Alpha Magic interface is for this transition template only, and others that have settings will be different. I've selected one and I'll close the interface. Note that the transition button has changed to the icon representing the transition. To change this to another mask type, click on the Settings button to get the interface back, and you'll see that the previous selection is highlighted. Select another one and close the interface. Of course, to change the transition duration, click on the clock button and make your change. Or drag the clip left or right, or adjust the transition handles if the clips have been trimmed. I'll remove the transition. I'll select another transition here, leaf through, and preview it. Note A and B that represent what would be the left and right objects. Now I'll drag it over the transition button at the head of the object. We get the new transition, and it has settings. This interface is quite different. It has some variants. Select one and play it back. I turned on automatic preview. You can reverse A and B. I'll try this. Notice the difference? There are also direction arrows and the size that can be played with. I'll apply gliding, which also has settings. Again, they're different. This one has springs, and watch the effect if you apply just a small amount. I'll leave it to you to experiment with the other transitions. I've seen comments on the Magix.info forum from some users indicating that there are hardly any transitions in MEP. As you've seen so far, there may only be 13 templates shown under Transitions Basic, but add in the other 20 for Alpha Magic, plus the variations to the others, and you already have many transitions. Add in changing the duration of a transition, and you have even more possibilities. Next, we'll look at Movements Basic. I'll preview the first one, Balls, by double-clicking or clicking on the play button. Look at the duration of the preview. It shows 128. This is just the duration of the preview video clip that is loaded, not necessarily the actual duration of the transition. Starting with no transition, I'll drag the Balls transition to the head of the selected object. It's applied and it plays back, but much slower than the preview. Remember, I said that a standard transition was 1 second. Click on the transition length button and the duration is 4 seconds, 6 frames. Definitely not 1 second. I'll open the transition menu. Note that at the bottom of the list, we now see Save as Fade Template. Select this and you can save the transition with a name. This is useful for transitions that have settings that you can modify and that you want to reuse in the same or a different project. I'll save this as my transition Balls. Note the folder name, as this is where your transitions will be saved. Open the menu again, and the Save Transition now shows up on the Transition menu under Recently Used Transitions. I'll remove the transition and try another one, Morphing. The duration is 3 seconds, 10 frames. If I now apply the first transition, Balls, without removing morphing, it gets replaced by Balls. But look at the duration. It's only 3 seconds, 10 frames instead of 4 seconds, 6 frames. The same as for morphing. So, as I mentioned, if you want to have the default transition duration for a transition, remove the transition if there is one, using Cut No Fade or another method, before applying the new transition. Under Effect Transitions Basic, there's a series that starts with Blurry. I'll apply the first one. It makes a clockwise blur transition. The duration is 2 seconds and 1 frame, as are all of them. None of these have settings. On to Shapes and Objects Basic. I'll apply the first one, and it's quite short at 26 frames. I'll remove the transition each time. Let's try Circle. This looks longer, and it is. 4 seconds, 5 frames. The next is Circle Echo, and it goes a lot faster at 26 frames. Here's an interesting one, Countdown. The duration is 4 seconds, 5 frames. So this series has different transition durations, but no settings. The categories starting with 3D have settings, and most are rudimentary. Under 3D Basic, I'll try the first one, Change. The duration is 2 seconds. The settings show just flip horizontally and flip vertically. Slide sideways goes very fast at 15 frames. The settings are the same, flip horizontally and vertically. Once again, if you have a transition and change it, the new one takes on the duration of the previous one. I'll apply the change template over top of the slide sideways 15 frame transition. And now we see a very quick change transition, not the 2-second template duration. So remember that, you can always adjust the duration to whatever you want. 3D Morph has some interesting transitions with different durations. Here is Flyer, coming in at 9 seconds. I would speed this one up. Take a look at the others, but remove the previous transition each time to see the template duration. The last one is 3D Series Basic, and for these, I've put a series of photos, 10 seconds long each, on the timeline. There are actually 2 series of similar transitions here. The first is called 3D Photo Table. Note the names of the next ones in the list, 3D Photo Table Transition 1 through 10. Here is a preview of the 3D Photo Table. Photo or video A zooms out and flies off to the left, while B comes in from the top and zooms into full screen. The transition is quite long. Applying 3D Photo Table brings up a dialog box. This will apply those 10 transitions in sequence to the number of objects that you indicate in the box. If you want this type of transition to be applied to the next 6 objects, then put 6 in the box. If you have, say, 30 photos on the timeline, then indicate 30. You'll get transitions on the next 30 photos, starting with 3D photo table transition 1, then 2, then 3, up to 10, and then it starts again at 1. The second series is called 3D Pinboard 1. It has 6 slightly different transitions that will be cycled through. Of course, you can always select any of the individual transitions and apply it by itself, or use it to change one that you've already made. Each of the transitions has settings, and these are limited to flip horizontally and vertically. As these transitions are quite long, I would speed them up by changing the transition length. As I pointed out in the Part 1 tutorial, if you create transitions on track 1 with nothing on other tracks, there are usually no problems, but if you have other objects like audio clips and titles, then objects to the right and on other tracks below and to the right will be moved. However, creating transitions on other tracks only affects objects to the right on that track. There's another problem. If you have trimmed a clip to be the exact length that you want, and now make a transition by dragging the clip over top of the adjacent one or applying a transition, the start or the end is now going to be hidden by part of the transition, and the duration from the end of the transition to the beginning of the next, if any, is now going to be less. Let's take photos as an example. You have a photo that you want to be on the screen for a certain length, say 3 seconds, so you've imported it at 3 seconds long. Making a crossfade transition decreases the time to 2 seconds that the full photo was showing because you lost part of that to the transition. Many of the template transitions are longer, so your image may not even be long enough to properly apply the template. If you add a transition to the right end, the photo will show for only 1 second between the transitions. Is this what you really want? If not, then you'll have to increase the duration of the photo or untrim part of a trimmed video clip. For photos and trimmed video clips, you can increase the object duration by dragging the left or right bottom handles left or right to create a transition. This maintains the viewing time outside of the transitions for a selected clip, but not for the adjacent clip. For importing photos, you can change the default import duration by changing the standard picture length parameter in the program settings under the Video Audio tab. The transition should not be the focus of attention, so don't make 3-second transitions with only 1 second of image or video. In addition to purchasing more transitions from Magix in the store, there are some third-party transitions that work very well with MEP and VPX. Adarash from Prodad comes with its own interface. You can purchase volumes 1 through 13 directly from Prodad. Make sure to get the plugins for Magix. Note that volumes 1 through 9 are standard definition, 10 to 13 are high definition. Apply the default transition, then open Settings to get the Adarash interface. The interface is quite detailed, lots to learn here. Pixelin has several transition plugins including Blur Master, Dissolve Master, Spice Master, and 3D 6-Pack. I suggest that you look at the videos on the Pixelin site. The most versatile is Spice Master Pro. Applying Spice Master applies the default transition. Open the settings to get the interface. I've done a few tutorials on this, however, this new version has a larger interface and a whole load of presets that can be modified using the tools in the interface. I suggest that you take a look at my first tutorial on using Spice Master, keeping in mind that it was done with an older version. If you have trimmed video clips, then you can use the Move Object Content command to adjust the trim points. This is useful if you want to change where a transition starts and ends in a trimmed clip. In Part 1, I mentioned making J&L cuts and transitions by holding down the Alt key and dragging the head or tail or an edge handle of the audio part of a video clip with audio on a separate track. I'd like to point out that holding down Alt temporarily releases the grouping of video with its audio, such that dragging can either be on the audio or the video part. As well, you can hold down Alt and drag a fade handle to make a fade in or fade out on just the audio or just the video part. One more tip. In the tutorials part of the Magix.info forum, John Baker has published an excellent tutorial on creating a transition from a video clip using the mask generator. I urge you to watch this, as it will give you more ideas as to how to make your own transitions. That's it for part 2 of Fades and Transitions. I suggest that you try out all of the transitions to see what they do and put a heart on your preferred ones. To see how to use the object and edit trimmers to adjust transitions in more detail and even faster in some cases, watch part 3. Thank you for watching. Till next time, make transitions.